Hey, what's up, Helix? Not much, man. I just I bought a plugin for Blender to help me do retopology, and I'm just watching the tutorials on it right now to figure out how to use it. Hey, Samantha, how's it going? What am I going to add to the game after? I'm actually not working on the game today. I am working on the short today. I'm just trying to learn some new tools. So the tool is called Retopoflow. And basically it allows me to do retopology on the characters. So right now I need, because his geometry looks like this, right? This is with the geometry, and that's not very good geometry. So I need to go in and redo all of this geometry um, so that it can be animated. And then eventually, a lot of technical stuff on this thing, because basically what I need to do afterwards is that I need to do cuts for the limbs. So I need to be able to cut off his arm, his upper arm, his shoulder, his head, his torso, his legs. Um, so different areas of cuts that I want to be able to add. And read topology is a bit boring, which is why I decided to download or buy a tool to help me out. It should be a little bit faster. Otherwise, doing it manually is very slow. Cool. Enjoy your snack or your dinner. Enjoy your food. Samantha, it's going well. I got a chance to check out your images from yesterday. Yeah, I like them. You've got a really good sense of lighting. I don't know if you've got a built-in rig or something like that, but the lighting is excellent. Ah, that makes sense then. Because I was looking at your lighting and I was like, this is a pretty good lighting setup because you had some really nice rim lights, some ambient lights, some key lights. I was like, ah, you know your lighting. So what is it that draws you to this kind of artwork? Do you guys want the audio? Put the audio. It'll be interesting for you guys.
Well, if I don't want that, I can turn on proportional editing. And then as I drag these handles around, everything else is going to smoothly follow. So you can scroll up or down just like in normal Blender to increase or decrease the radius of that. And not only does it work with moving the anchor points of the strip around, it also works with rotating those anchor points. So I can really carefully position my key loops even after I've connected them to surrounding geometry. That's definitely my favorite part about polystrips in version. It's a kind of hidden feature, but all in all, polystrips is pretty simple.
Are your ears?
It's for drawing strips of quads,
Sorry about that.
nothing more and nothing less. I find it really powerful for laying out the key loops around important details. Next after polystrips, we have strokes, and this is probably the most powerful tool in Retopoflow, and the one I use second most after polypen. I use polypen a little bit more because it's more precise, but anything involving filling in large patches of quads is where strokes shines. To use it, similar to polystrips, hold down Control, left click and drag, and instead of creating a strip of quads, now it's going to create a strip of edges. In the redo panel, you can change the count of how many vertices are inserted, or you could also do that by holding Control and scrolling up or down. Now, once you have a selected strip of edges, you can turn that into a patch of quads in a couple ways. One is you can draw a parallel stroke, just like so. Or you can choose any of these vertices to start from, and you can see that it's snapping because the yellow ring is highlighting around the cursor. And once you have that, then you can draw outwards and extrude a patch that way. Or you could also start from the ends and define the other corners of the patch and draw out in a C shape. And again, any of these methods are going to allow you to adjust the number of cuts in between by holding down Control and scrolling up or down. Strokes can also be used to bridge between two areas. For example, if I have a stroke over here and let's extrude that over there, then we can connect these two areas by selecting some strip of edges, holding down Control, and drawing from one vertex to the next. You can see the size of the edges is very different and it's interpolated between them. When bridging, we can also adjust the number of counts with Control scrolling, but we can also hold Alt and scroll to adjust which vertex it's connected to. We can also use strokes to fill in L-shaped holes by selecting one side of the L. Here I'll select the shortest path by selecting one vertex and then Control, Shift, and clicking the last vertex. And then I can go to the other side of the L and draw out from that vertex. Again, making sure that that mouse cursor has the yellow ring around it to make sure that it's going to snap. I could also do that the exact opposite way. I could select this side of the L instead and draw out parallel that way. Regardless of which way you choose though, just make sure that you're drawing parallel to the selection. It's also possible to use strokes to do a type of grid fill. Let's say that we have a stroke here, and let's increase the number of cuts. And same thing over here. Then let's take these edges and extrude that outwards. Then take those and extrude them up to about here. And let's say we want to fill in this section that looks like a U. Well, to do that, we just need to select these bottom edges, hold down Control, and connect two of the top vertices. We can control where these connect just by holding down Control and scrolling. So we can either go backwards or forwards. So again, that's making a selection and drawing parallel to that selection, starting and or ending on another vertex. Strokes can also be used to make rings. So if we were to go down towards this eye here and deselect everything else to start a new stroke, I could hold down Control and just draw around this eye like so, and there we have our loop. I can hold Control and increase or decrease the segments by scrolling, and then I could extrude this loop either inwards or outwards just by dragging out from any of the vertices. If I go in, that's going to be a bit cramped, so I'll drag outwards like so. Or I could also just, if I don't want to extrude evenly all the way around, I could keep this loop selected and draw a different shape like so. And now it's still going to connect those two loops, but I can be more specific about that shape of the outer loop. So again, I can either draw perpendicular or parallel. Now, Strokes has a ton of options in the tool settings, so let's look at each of them. First is the insert method. By default, it's set to average, which means that if we were to select some existing edges and then draw out from that, then the number of cuts in between is going to be based on the average length of those edges, which in practice means that they're going to be as evenly spaced quads as possible. So whether I make a stroke really close to the existing edge or really far away, we're still going to get evenly spaced quads. However, if I were to switch this over to brush radius, then the radius of the brush that you see as you hold control is going to determine the length of the edges. So if I were to have a really small brush, then I'm going to get a lot of cuts. Let's make it even smaller to exaggerate that, like so. And if I have a really big brush, then I'm going to get a lot fewer cuts. You could also set this to fixed, so have the same number of cuts each time you stroke, regardless of whether it's close or very far away. The one time I usually find this helpful is when I need to set it all the way to 1 and I just want to make simple extrusions, so it can be good for that. But for the most part, I leave this at average. Now, when you're starting a new stroke and nothing is selected, then it doesn't have any existing edges to average between, so that's when it uses the brush size. So you can hit F to adjust the brush size, just like any other brush in Blender. Start drawing, and then start extruding. Next after that, we have the snap distance, and that's how far away your cursor needs to be from an existing vertex in order for that yellow circle to highlight and for new vertices to attach to it. So if you want to make it more sensitive, then you could decrease this, or if you want it to be a lot less sensitive, then you can increase this and have it attach much more easily. I think the default of 10 pixels though is pretty good, so I leave it at that. Next we have stabilize, which is also an option in polystrips that I skipped over before. This is the same thing as stabilize strokes in pretty much any drawing application. So if I were to set that to 0, hold down Control and draw, the path is going to follow my cursor exactly. However, if I were to set this all the way to 1 and try to do that same thing, it's going to lag behind a little bit and smooth out the stroke. So this allows you to get nice, exact swooping curves without too much jitter, at the expense of it being a little bit more difficult to make sharp corners. Though you can still make a sharp corner if you wait for the stroke to catch up and then continue on. Again, the default here is pretty good, and I like to leave it at that. Next up we have blending, and this is if you draw two parallel strokes like so, how does it interpolate between them? Let's say I increase the cut count here, and you can see that there's a nice smooth transition between the two strokes. I can adjust this either in the redo panel with the smooth blending option, or by holding down Shift and scrolling up or down. A value of 0 is going to make everything linear, a negative value is going to make it smoothed in the opposite way, and a value of 1 or above is going to add that smooth interpolation. I can also adjust the spacing here, which I don't generally need to do, but if you want to, you can start or end the loops closer or farther away from the strokes. And then lastly, we have an option for how to interpret T-strips. And T-strips is where you have a selected set of edges and draw outwards such that you're making a T. So by default, it's set to flat, which is good for a lot of simple cases. But let's say you want to draw a curve here, like so, well, that's not going to work quite as well. So in this case, you might want to switch that to follow, and then all of those in between edge loops are going to follow the tangent of the curve. So this works great sometimes, but again, it's not always what you want, so there's an option for both. The other option is fan, and that's a lot more useful if you are starting with a set of curved edges. So for example, if we have a more complex edge like this, and we try to extrude outwards, then that's not going to work so well towards the extremes. However, if I were to switch this to fan, then it's going to use that initial curvature and extrude outwards along the normal, giving us an even thickness all the way around. So if I set this to fan, I can make a lot more complex strokes here, and just extrude outwards and get a nice even thickness all the way around. So which one you use is totally up to you. They're all great for different situations, and you can pick between them at any point. And with that, that's all the settings in the strokes tool. I know we ran through that kind of quickly, and there are a lot of gestures to get used to, but mostly just remember that you first make some selection, and then either draw parallel to that, or draw from or to any other vertex. Looks like I didn't quite hit that one, so let's wait for the yellow circle to be hovering over it, and now it's going to connect. Once you get the hang of this, then filling in empty gaps between key loops becomes really, really fast. Contours is the tool for surrounding cylindrical forms with loops, so it's perfect for arms, legs, torso.
Sorry, I'll be right back. Use the washroom.
Or just anything roughly cylindrical. To use it, just like the other tools, hold down Control and left click and drag. This time we're going to go across the form that we want to wrap around. Then let go with the left mouse button, and a new loop will be created that goes all the way around the geometry. In the redo panel, you can adjust the number of vertices that were inserted, or you can just hold Control and scroll up or down. Then to extrude that loop, you can do that same thing again. Left click, hold down Control, and drag across the surface. As long as that middle dot is over the form that you want to wrap around, then it's going to connect. You can also left click and drag through face loops, just like so, and even extend existing sections, even if the end loops aren't the ones that are selected. So here I have a middle loop selected, but I can draw above this, and it'll still connect correctly. So I can also switch down to the bottom now, and everything just works as it should. Now with contours, there are a couple different options for how these loops get inserted, and by default the method is walk, which traverses every face as it goes around until it gets back to the start. This is incredibly accurate. As long as the middle dot is over the surface you want to wrap around, it's going to work. So even though this leg on the right here is mostly occluded, I can still wrap around it perfectly by making sure that that middle dot is over that leg. And I can work just like this. So this has a big advantage over any screen space tool because it works perfectly even on forms that are overlapping. The only downside of this method is that calculating every face means that it can sometimes be kind of slow. For example, if I go over here and make a cut across his midsection where there are a lot more faces, you can see that it hangs just a little bit before it catches up. And let's see that one more time. Left click and drag. It hangs just a little bit and then catches up. So when you have extremely dense meshes that are way more dense than this, things can start to slow down. So to fix this, we've added a couple different input methods. Both of these are still experimental and not guaranteed to work all of the time, but we're going to keep working on them until they're just as good as walk, but a lot faster. The first one, which is skip, as the name implies, does a similar thing to walk and just uses that middle dot, but jumps over certain faces. So this makes it significantly faster. You can see that it's just immediate as I go through even some of these dense meshes, but you'll also notice that it's not as accurate. When there's no other geometry that could possibly get in the way, then it's pretty simple. But if it's in a spot where things could get confusing, let's go up the leg here. And all of these are working fine. Let's find a spot where it doesn't work. Okay, you can see that one jumped all the way to the end there. So it jumped the face and jumped a bit too far. So with this one, you have to be a little bit more careful. And again, it's still experimental and might not be the final solution that we go with. Another one that's really promising is fast, and this one uses the 2 dots on the outside as well. So as long as all 3 dots are over the surface that you want to wrap around, then it's going to be pretty accurate and also a lot quicker. And let's make sure I have nothing selected here. Start fresh, insert a loop, there we go. And you can see this one is incredibly fast and it works quite accurately, again, as long as all 3 of those dots are over the surface. What would happen is if I make a really big selection here and those other 2 dots are over the other legs, then it's going to try to wrap around those as well, and things are going to start to get messy. So I generally decrease this width here to, let's say, 0.25 or so, and it needs a little bit of width in order to actually calculate the direction of the circle and make sure that it's going around the correct part of the mesh. But keeping those closer to this bottom section. And overall it works great, but there are some edge cases where it doesn't work, especially, as I mentioned before, when not all 3 of those dots are over the same surface. You can see that breaks it really easily. So this is one that you can definitely use if your poly counts are getting higher, but as I mentioned before, there are still some edge cases that we need to work out, so walk is the default. It's the trusty, reliable one, all 3 of them, there's for your needs. Contours is a really powerful tool for wrapping around cylindrical objects, which on one hand is pretty niche, but is also something that comes up all the time in retopology. The last 2 tools in Retopoflow 4.0 are Tweak and Relax. Both of these are brush-based tools and they work on existing vertices, so first let's lay down a patch of quads. I'll hit W and switch over to the Strokes tool, then I'll hit F and change the scale of the brush to be pretty small, that way we can get some really dense quads to work with and really see how this works. Then I'll hold down Control, left click and drag to draw a strip. I'll draw a parallel strip, and then Control, left click, drag one more strip. Now we have this big patch of pretty dense quads. Then I'll hit W and go back to the Tweak tool. And this one works pretty much like any other brush in Blender, and it's just for translating the vertices across the surface of the high poly sculpt. So left click and drag, and the vertices will follow along. Just like any other brush in Blender, you can hit F to change the size. So let's make it a little bit bigger. You can hit Shift F to change the strength. A low strength is just a gentle nudge, whereas a high strength really makes those vertices follow exactly with the cursor. Then we can also change the fall off, which if we hit Control F, bring that all the way down, then all vertices are going to be affected equally. And if I had hit Control F and bring that all the way up, now only the vertices in the middle will be affected fully, and anything towards the outside of the circle will be affected less and less. Now, as I nudge these vertices around and make these larger scale changes, you might notice that things start to look a little bit ugly. I can make these big, large scale changes. Let's say I want these to run along the back. Well, I can do that, but also things get really out of whack. But that's where the Relax tool comes in. I'll hit W and this time switch to the Relax tool, and now I can simply left click and drag, and all of these vertices are going to smoothly move towards evenly spaced quads. Both Tweak and Relax have some masking options, which are really, really helpful. I'll switch over to the Tweak tool, and in the masking settings in the tool properties, first let's look at selected. By default, all vertices are included regardless of their selection status, but we can switch this to only, such that if we make a selection, like for example if I shift, double click, and select an edge loop, now I'm only working with that edge loop and nothing around it. But I can also switch this to exclude and work with everything except the selection. I find this really helpful for if I want to quickly, let's say, lasso select some vertices, and move everything around that little patch. Underneath that, then we have options for boundary. If I set this to exclude, then it'll just mask automatically those boundary vertices, and that way we can't change the silhouette of the patch. Another option that's really great though is slide. This allows us to move those vertices along the boundary, but it's not going to allow us to move them in the other direction, which helps keep the silhouette, but also allows us to adjust our spacing. We can also optionally include or exclude corners, or occluded vertices, which are vertices that are under the existing mesh. All of these masking settings are also available in Relax, and they really help us preserve important parts of the mesh. Up here at the top in the tool settings, you can find quick toggles for each of these settings. For example, I can quickly mask out the selection and smooth around it, or make sure that I'm only smoothing the selection and nothing else. Relax also has a number of algorithm options which you can get to in this drop-down or in the algorithm panel in the tool properties, and these adjust what Relax tries to do under the hood. By default, it tries to move everything towards evenly spaced quads, but there are some situations where you might not want that. For example, if we take our strokes tool here, and I'll just draw a new stroke there, hold Control and scroll up. Now I'm pretty far from evenly spaced quads, and maybe I want to keep them more rectangular and not so square. Well, if I switch over to Relax, by default it's going to try to force those to become square, even if it means pushing things around a little bit too much. Well, if you want, you can also turn off all of these average settings and only use straighten edges, and that's going to do a bit more of a simple smooth and still straighten things out, but it'll allow you to keep more of your non-square geometry. When you do want those evenly spaced quads though, then you can turn on these top 3 average options and continue working. Now, I know that these settings here aren't super intuitive, so we're going to be doing a lot of work in the future to make Relax better in more edge cases and also be more user-friendly. One of my favorite things about both Tweak and Relax,
Fluid,
though, is
how's
that
it going,
you can
dude?
access them from any other tool. Let's say I'm working in strokes and want to extrude this part of the mesh at an angle. Well, I can hold down Control and draw that line, but then to tweak it,
You
just
started
simply hold
streaming.
Control and
Nice, dude.
Shift,
Congratulations.
left click and drag,
What are you streaming?
and make my tweak. And then to smooth that out, I can simply hold down Shift, left click and drag, and smooth it out. So this makes it really fast to work with larger strips of quads because I can simply extrude them, move them as I need to,
Yeah, go ahead. Post the link.
and then hold Shift and smooth them out. Having those two quickly available alongside every other tool is amazing. And with that, we've covered how to use all of the individual tools in Retopoflow 4.0, but now let's talk about some of the options that you have across all of the different tools. Now let's take a look at how mirroring works in Retopoflow, since that's something you're probably going to want to use on all sorts of characters and objects. To use mirroring is really simple. Just click on either the X, Y, and or Z axes up here in the tool settings or in the mirror options. That's going to add a mirror modifier, and you'll see the mesh appear on both sides of the axes. You can also do this same thing by adding your own mirror modifier. Just add modifier and mirror. Let's say we do the Y axis. You can see that reflected up here in the tool settings and in the mirror options. But let's switch back to the X axis, and you might notice that if you add the mirror modifier yourself, you're not going to see the result over here on the left. That's simply because Blender's retopology overlay unfortunately doesn't show the result
Cool.
of modifiers.
Thanks for the link, dude. We'll,
unless
I'll
you
check it out
use
in a
this
bit.
option here, which is show on cage. Once you turn that on, then you'll be able to see that on the other side, and that's one of the things that adding it via Retopoflow does for you. So now we can actually see the mesh on same, or just click on all that. Now let's take a look at how mirroring works and objects. To use mirroring is really simple. Just click on either the X, Y, and or Z axes up here in the tool settings or in the mirror options. That's going to add a mirror modifier, and you'll see the mesh appear on both sides of the axes. You can also do this same thing by adding your own mirror modifier. just add modifier and mirror, and in the mirror options. But let's switch back to the x-axis, and you might notice that if you add the mirror modifier yourself, you're not going to see the result over here on the left. That's simply because Blender's retopology overlay unfortunately doesn't show the result of modifiers unless you use this option here, which is show on cage. Once you turn that on, then you'll be able to see that on the other side, and that's one of the things that adding it via Retopoflow does for you. So now we can actually see the mesh on the other side and manipulate it like so, but you might be a little bit confused if you use it this way, because if you get all turned around and you forget which side is which, you might be selecting something on the left side, try to move it, and it moves in the opposite direction. Or if you're using polypen, you might want to extrude from this section, and it connects to the other side. The reason this is happening is because under the hood, the mesh that you're editing is really only this, and the other side is just for display purposes. In native Blender though, this is the only way to be able to see it while using the retopology overlay, something we definitely hope to fix in Blender itself later on. But we also have a couple other ways of visualizing the mirror in case this is confusing. It's just the default because it looks the best, but if you go to the mirror options, you can go down to display and change this to none, or wire, or solid. What this is going to do is just add a temporary object, and that temporary object is going to use geometry nodes to showcase the exact same thing that you have on one side on the other side. But because it's just a regular mesh and isn't using the retopology overlay, it has to be offset from the surface. So depending on how big your object is, it might look like it's being occluded by the source object, or it might be floating way off into space. You can adjust this in two ways. First, you can adjust the retopology overlay setting and make sure that that's sized appropriately for your object. And you can also adjust the displacement of just the mirror if you want. Then as you work, it's extremely clear which side is the correct side to work on. Now you can still add geometry to the other side, just like you can in normal Blender, but it'll stop you from accidentally selecting and trying to perform any actions on the side that's not real. So this is how I often like to work because it helps avoid confusion on which side I should be selecting and manipulating. But the downside is that since it's not using the retopology overlay, it does have to have an actual offset from the mesh, and that can be way too big or way too small if you don't have the overlay sized correctly. For now though, let's go through the different tools and see how they play with the mirror modifier enabled. First is polypen, and this one is really easy to work with the mirror modifier because if you just overshoot the axis of symmetry just a little bit, it'll snap right towards the center. So whether you're using the tri-quad option or the regular quad option, you can just go right down the axis of symmetry and everything's going to be snapped into place. Of course, this is if clipping is enabled in the modifier, which you can change in the modifier itself or up here in Retopoflow. It's just mirroring the same setting, so either way. But if we turn this off, then of course we can rip things out from the axis of symmetry if we need to. So you have all your options there, and working with it in polypen is pretty easy. But let's also take a look at how it plays with the other tools. Polystrips is a little bit more complicated, but still pretty easy. If I just hold down Control and drag and draw down the axis of symmetry, then you'll see that everything is going to snap nicely to it. I can also draw to the axis of symmetry, just like so, or draw away from the axis of symmetry. Either way, everything's going to snap nicely and will be mirrored on the other side. There is one extra setting in the mirror options that's specifically for polystrips, and we can see this if we go to the tool properties in the properties editor, or you can also get to this in the sidebar or the mirror options up here. But if we go to the mirror panel, polystrips has an option called active side, and this determines which side the real geometry is created on. So if I were to start my stroke on the right side, then the geometry is going to be created on the right side. And if I start my stroke on the left side, that's where it's going to be created as well. The only time this is going to get you into trouble with polystrips is if you overlap way over to the other side and then try to draw like so, then it'll create the geometry on the incorrect side. So just don't overlap yourself too much and you'll be fine. But if you really want, then you can also choose end, and that way you can start as far as you want over there and then just end up on the correct side. Or you could choose most, and then whichever side you draw the most on is going to be the one that has the real geometry. So most is also an option for the default, but I find its behavior to be a little bit less predictable than start. So by default, just whichever side you start on is going to be the one that has the real geometry created. This option is also available in strokes, but you get an additional option for what happens when you cross the line of symmetry. By default, it's just going to clamp like any other tool in Blender. So if we just go across the line of symmetry, it'll clamp right towards the center there. But we could also change this to reflect. And that way you can draw straight lines all the way across, and it kind of bounces that back. And you can see what that looks like here. So it really looks like it's preserving the original stroke. So that's what I usually stick with. Once you've created, this also makes it really easy to attach things to the line I usually stick with. Once you've created that initial stroke that crosses the line of symmetry, then you can extrude and do whatever else you need to do. This also makes it really easy to attach things to the line of symmetry. For example, if we want to extrude this edge here, or maybe both of these, overshoot the line of symmetry just a little bit, like so, I can extrude right towards the center there, and everything gets merged perfectly. So strokes and symmetry is pretty easy to work with. Contours doesn't have any special options, but it just mirrors whatever you do on one side to the other side. So nothing particularly special, but it works great with symmetry. And tweak and relax also work with mirroring just as well. The main thing to remember is just that if you have the display set to applied, then you have to remember which side is the active side, or the one that has the real geometry on it. And if you add your own modifier, just be sure to check on cage so that you can actually see the result. We are planning to add support for edit mode symmetry, or the symmetry options up here, so that both sides will be real geometry as soon as it's created. It's more of a destructive type of editing. So we will be adding that in the near future, but at the moment it's all modifier based. Another thing to remember about the mirror modifier is that it's all based around the object origin and local orientation.
Yeah, Samantha, it does seem like there's a lot of,
If I were to
I
have
think
this-
it's just the inner tools. It's all like the under engine stuff. There's actually only what? I think 5 or 6 tools inside there. There's just a lot of potential settings that you can muck around with.
Sphere,
But it seems
over
pretty
here.
straightforward. So
and let's create a new retopology at cursor, and the cursor is pretty far away from the sphere.
and I think he's also being incredibly like thorough. I think this is just this orange turbine style of or this guy's style. Yeah, no, it's it seems like because I've been manually doing retopology inside Blender just with the Blender tools, and it's not terrible, but it's not fast either, right? So, or just to save a little bit of time, I figure let's
And if I were to
just
add some geometry to one
go by the
side,
top, the
on
retop
my
tool.
X
and
mirror,
give it a
well,
shot.
then it's going to be way over there in space because it's all based around the object origin. Same thing with the local orientation. Even if I were to, let's say, Alt-G and move my sphere back to the center, but then I, rotate it around like so. Or actually, let's use a cube so we can actually see the rotation better. I'll create a cube,
Feel free to lurk.
down a bit, apply that scale, and double
It's a
tap
pretty
on
casual
the
stream today
rotate
too, so
weird way. If I do a Shift-A mesh retopology at cursor, even though the cursor is in the same location as the cube's object origin, let's say I make some geometry, turn on my X mirror, well, it's not going to be on the other side of the cube just because they have different local orientations. You can see my orientation up here is set to local, and when I select the cube, I have a different local orientation than my retopology object. So when you're working with objects that are rotated and moved off to the side, that's a good time to use retopology from active, because that's going to copy that local orientation and location from the active object. So now I can work just on one side like so, turn on my X mirror, and it's going to be mirrored perfectly to the other side of the cube. Next, let's take a look at some of the miscellaneous settings that Retopoflow has that you might find useful. first, let's look in the tweaking options. Here you can enable or disable auto merge, which just mirrors Blender's setting over here in options. So that's exactly the same. But here's where you can also set the selection distance. Let's say I have some geometry here. The selection distance is just how far away your cursor can be from a vertex or edge in order for it to count as selected. So you can change that under selection distance. And the one thing to keep in mind here is that vertices always have priority over edges. So if you're hovering over an edge and you're within that distance of a vertex, it's going to grab the vertex. But if you're outside of that distance, then it's going to grab the edge. So if you find yourself grabbing edges too often, then you can go to tweaking and increase this distance here. And that way it'll prioritize the vertices more. Just be aware that if you crank this up too much, then you might accidentally grab vertices when your cursor is way too far away. So usually I find the default of 20 to be pretty good. Now next you can auto select using your mouse or keyboard. This is just the behavior where as you left click and drag, it automatically selects what's under your cursor. And this is generally what you want to do while tweaking with your mouse. However, you can also do this with the keyboard if you want. If you hit G to grab, then it can automatically pick what's under your mouse as you hit G on the keyboard. So some people find this better for ergonomics and they're not clicking quite as much, so that can be better for your hands sometimes, but that's not how Blender tools normally work, so that is off by default. Next, you have the option to enable the native transform for Blender rather than use Retopoflow's transform, and this is meant more for hard surface modeling. So one of the things that's really cool about Retopoflow's transform, and I'll turn this off just to demonstrate this, is that we can snap to the vertices of the low poly object and just kind of easily merge just like that, and snap to any of these low poly vertices while not snapping to the vertices of the high poly. So I can smoothly move across the surface of the high poly, but snap to the low poly. And this is something that's not otherwise possible in Blender. If we use the native transform, which is just what happens if you're in any of these other tools and hit G to grab, for example, what that's going to do is if you have vertex snapping enabled, let's just go ahead and I'll shift and select vertex snapping here, then it will snap to not only its own vertices, but also every vertex of the high poly, meaning that you won't get a smooth transformation over any high poly sculpt. But if you're retopologizing hard surfaces, then maybe you want this. You can also shift to select edge snapping as well, so you can do that too if you want, and also, snap to edges not only of the low poly object, but of the high poly object as well. Pulling or dense sculpts, then you probably want to use the low poly. This is an improvement that we'd really like to see in Blender at some point, but for now we have our own transform for that specific reason. Another fun fact about Retopoflow's transform is that it automatically picks between face project and face nearest. Both of those have pros and cons, and Retopoflow picks the best one depending on what it is that you have selected. So you don't have to worry about managing that when you're using Retopoflow tools. Next up, we have some settings in the general options. We already looked at the overlay and the retopology offset distance here, but this is where you can also fade the inactive objects if you want. And there are a couple settings for the UI. So I need a good amount of space in the tool settings, so turning that off and just making that into a mat. I'll add a plane, and let's say a cube. And let's add a sphere. And we have all these different objects in the scene. And then I'll go back to my retopology object, hit tab to enter edit mode and continue my retopology. It's going to snap to every visible object in the scene that has some mesh data. But let's say you only want to snap to the bear. Well, there's a couple things that you could do. First, you could hide any of the other objects, and then, of course, they won't be able to be snapped to. But if you want to see them and not be able to snap to them, well, then we have two options. Under General and Sources,
We already went
choose
over
to
this.
only include. Now that we've seen how to use all the Retopoflow tools individually, let's check out how to use them all together in a project.
We need a short break. We'll be back.
For this demo, I have a sculpture by Kent Trammell, and we're just going to retopologize the face. So to start out, I'll hit Shift-A, Mesh, and retopology from active, since I have the body active and the origin point is just at the center of the grid. And to start out, I usually like to start around the eyes. So for that, I'll switch over to strokes, and we could make a stroke all the way around like so, but I want to make sure that we have the corners of the stroke right in the corners of the eyes, as well as make sure that there's the same number of cuts above as below. So what I'll actually do is make my brush significantly smaller, and then just draw around the top part of the eye, hold Control, left click and drag, and I'll scroll up until we have 10 strips. Then I'll deselect everything and do the same thing below, making sure to connect right in the corners, and then Control scroll up until we have 10. Once we have that, then I can double click to select the entire loop, and then from there grab a corner, Control drag outwards, and then I'll Control scroll down since I only want one extrusion there. And let's do a little bit of rearranging before we extrude again. We definitely want the corner of the eye to go straight out, and we want 2 loops at least to go over and around the nose. So I'll just tweak these into place so that they're going a little bit more straight out, just like so. And then I can more evenly space out the rest of these over here, and I'll do the same thing on this side. I'll put this more in the corner of the eye. Have the last 2 going outwards like so. And then adjust the spacing of the rest. Once we have that, then I'll double click the outside, hold down Control and left click drag again, and then Control scroll down just to decrease the count, and I'll actually just hit F and increase the brush size again, just so I don't have to keep doing that. But this is going to give us a good start. I can then take this and follow the ridge of the brow, as well as go down around this part of the eye. And then we're gonna need a little bit more detail in here, so I'll add in another edge loop, but only after tweaking everything to make sure it's going in the right direction, and just following the anatomy as much as I can. Okay, Control R, add in one more edge loop, and something like that should be good. Okay, once we have that, then we can continue on. It looks like rotating my view is a little bit off, so I'm going to select everything, hit period on the number pad, and that's gonna make orbiting a little bit nicer. And moving on from here, let's go ahead and take these 2 loops here and connect them to the middle. But now would be a good time to turn on symmetry. So I'll just click the X up here in the tool settings, turn on mirroring, and that way I can draw just over the other side of the symmetry plane, and everything's gonna snap right there. So I don't know yet exactly how many loops we want to define his nose, but this looks like a pretty good start. We can take this loop and go down. I'll draw across the nose like that, and maybe Control scroll up a little bit. I'll start out with as few loops as possible, and then we can always add more later as we go. And up here, let's see, we definitely want a loop going up and around the brows. So let's just define what we already know that we need. I'll select one edge, Control Shift, select another edge to select the shortest path between the 2. And then Control, just draw and define that brow a little bit more. Maybe I'll bring this edge loop up just a little bit. Again, trying to follow the anatomy as much as possible while also keeping the loops nice and smooth. And then here we want this to connect right towards the middle, so again, let's just draw right on the line of symmetry there. And then this part of the eye is going to be a little bit tricky, because if we make a face, I'll just switch over to polypen so we can visualize this a bit better. If I make a face here, that's going to be really stretched, and if I make a face, there or there, that doesn't quite work, so we definitely need to redirect over here a little bit, go in different directions. So let's go ahead and create a face like this, just from that top loop coming in. And then this is going to make a nice face. I'll select this edge and tap F just to use Blender's nice fill command. And then we can easily fill this in with polypen as well. Now we'll probably want at least another edge loop running down there, but let's hold off on that for now. Let's keep things simple and then only add that in if we need to. Let's continue following the anatomy as much as possible. So let's take this loop running from the eye and bring that down towards the nose, just following the ridge of where the fat kind of meets the nose there. We can line this up, make that a quad, make another quad on top of that. Again, just selecting the edge and hitting F. And then I'd like to follow down and along the cheek here. So I'll switch over to strokes, select those three edges, and then extend them to this vertex all the way on the left. That gives us a nice loop that goes down and around. And I want to leave a little bit of gap between here and the nose because we're going to want to add a little bit more geometry there going around the nose. So let's give that a little bit of space for now. And then on one side, on this left side here, I'll switch over to polypen again. And this time continue down and a little bit towards the mouth, kind of outlining the fat section of what's behind the lips there. And then on the other side, we can continue this up and around and help define that cheekbone. There we go. We could continue this up and around and connect there, but that's starting to get really stretched. So we're either going to need to add more vertices or branch off in a different direction. So we could, use this to create a split, but that's going to be a little bit messy, and I'd rather just keep this loop going up and around just to keep things as simple as possible. So adding more vertices is not a bad idea here since it's going to be right in the corners of the eye, and we'll definitely want more detail there if he needs to squint or something. So not a bad place to add detail, and then we can massage these details over a little bit just to give that more room. And then connect up like so. That looks pretty good. We can adjust the spacing of this a little bit, but I don't want to spend too much time on that as we can always relax things later on. Now that we have the main part of the eye, let's see, let's actually add those same loops on this side just so there's the same amount of detail. And then we can simply take relax here, and I'll use a smaller brush and a smaller strength just to make sure we're not messing up anything we don't want to mess up, but we can relax these vertices here just to space them out a little bit better. That looks pretty good. Then I'll switch back to polypen. Maybe set these back to the ridge of the nose. And then let's continue this down and towards the mouth. I don't know exactly where we want our loops quite yet, but I'll just place some points at the major extremes of where things are rounded and curved. For example, it looks like we need a little more definition here. We can look at from the side. Oh, looks like that was accidentally connected. Let me just hold down Control when nothing is selected, and that way we can make a cut cleanly with polypen. Continue on down towards the bottom of the nose here, and then extrude this down towards the mouth. And then we'll need more cuts in here for sure. Again, we don't know exactly how many we need quite yet as we're going along, but so far this looks pretty good. We just want to continue defining the anatomy and then fill in the rest of the gaps however we can. So let's start out really simply, and then if we need to make things more complex, then we can do that. Here's an example of where we probably do want to get a little more complex or have some smaller faces, because we have a crease right here, a pretty sharp crease for the lips, and we need to go all the way around and make a loop from the top lip all the way to the bottom, and we can't really do that with a set of big quads. So what I'll do is I'll add in another edge loop here. So this is going to be a pretty thin strip, but again, if we subdivide it or anything else, it's just gonna sharpen that up, but it's sharp in a place where we want sharpness, so that's not bad. And then as we get down towards the corner of the mouth, we want to rotate this. Like so, and then by the time it gets down here, it's going to be rotated like that. Rotated downwards. And then up towards the base of the lip like this. And then I'll try to have the same number of vertices on the bottom as the top, just so if things are animated, then the vertices can meet exactly. All right, that gives us a decent base to work with. Maybe I'll add one more loop in here just for some extra detail. But then if we were to extrude the lips downward, then we can finish this definition here. And if we need more details in any particular place, like for example, it looks like we really should have a bit more detail here. I'll move, make sure to add in another edge loop, and let's connect this up like so. Same thing down here. And then for the loop that goes just above that crease, let's follow that all the way around the mouth. And we could do this with strokes, but I'll do it with poly pen just to be precise for now. Something like that. And then we can finish it up with strokes, but first let's finish up the inside. And then I'll do the same on the bottom. I'll just make one big quad all the way up, and then we can add another loop cut later just to finish off the detail. But again, trying to match the bottom vertices with the top vertices. Something like that. And then in here, it's gonna get really cramped. So we could move these outwards a little bit if we need to. But once we have both of these edges, then we can make two quads like so. And if polypen attaches the wrong one, just select the edge you want to extend from. Okay, something like that. Now we have a loop that runs all the way around. Make sure that everything's good in that tiny crease, and that looks pretty good. We could add another loop if you think we need it, but I'll just stick with one for now. And then, of course, if we were finishing this off, we would want to continue on into the mouth, but for this section, I'll just leave that as is. And then let's switch over to strokes and finish off this bottom section. I'll select the edge all the way on the right, Control-Shift, select the edge on the left, and then draw in the loop connecting those two. And then I might want to adjust these vertices to follow the chin a little bit more. Just like so. And then let's try to extend this a little bit further. Let's see, I'll take the center section all the way down to the corner of the mouth and extend that all the way down the chin. Now I don't want to add too many loops here. Again, I want to keep things as simple as possible. So let's go ahead and decrease the count to 3. And then of course, if we need more, then we can always add that, but it's always better to err on the side of simplicity and add loops later if you need it than overcomplicate things from the get-go. Yeah, we'll probably want to do some adjustments there, but for now, let's go ahead and take this bottom loop and extend that all the way up. This is a perfect place to use poly strips. We can hold down Control, left click and drag, go all the way up there. Again, we'll try to keep things as simple as possible. And then if we need to make any adjustments, we can hold Control-Shift and use the tweak tool. That can help us make larger scale changes. And then And now that we have that defined, let's figure out how we want the cheek to meld into the mouth there. So we'll switch back to polypen since we're doing more detailed work. And I'll just make a quad that looks like it lines up with part of the mouth. That looks like a pretty natural connection, so let's go ahead and fuse those two together. Select one edge, hold down Control, and just bridge that. And then, let's see, this looks like it might be a little too stretched to make a quad, and I'd really like to define this part of the cheek a little bit more, so let's just continue this quad up like so. And then down here, we can continue this over and around the nose, but we're gonna need a little bit more detail here to have at least one loop wrap around the nose, so I'll hit Control R, add in one more edge loop there. And let's bring this up, and let's try connecting that vertex. I don't know for sure if that's a great connection or not, but we'll give it a try. And then let's connect that edge up like so. And continue our quads upwards. Now this one's definitely too stretched, so we'll see if we can kind of tweak some of these edge loops. Give us a little bit more detail here. See, that spacing still looks okay. And then let's continue up and around the nose. Just like so, and then let's connect it to the bridge of the nose like that. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this, but I would prefer a loop that goes all the way around the nose, at least around this section, though we can always do an inset or an outset later. So I'll take this top section and just continue this downwards like that. And given how round this nose is, I really do think we need a bit more detail here. So I'll hit Control R, add another loop going up and through the forehead, and then we can relax that out later, so I wouldn't worry about the spacing just yet. So we at least have enough detail here to round out the nose, and then we can bring this loop down and around and connect that into the bottom of the nose. That conveniently gives us a quad there, so I'll just fill that by tapping F. And then we want to follow around the nose with at least one loop, so let's try to do that here. And I'll try to match that up with kind of the bulbous part of the nose. Then I can tap F a couple times, fill in more faces there. That'll give us another quad we can fill down there. And then let's continue this out instead of wrapping it back around this way, because that's going to create a spiral. If you see the loop here, that'll just spiral up and around. So instead, let's add another edge loop, just like so, right on the little base of the nostrils there, and connect it like that. And then we can slide these over and space them out better as we go. But then this section here, which we definitely want to define a little bit better, let's go ahead and select all of our vertices. I'll move that out a little bit. I really want to try to not pinch this guy, so I'll try to give that vertex a little bit of space, but I also want to match the shape of the nostril more generally. And once we have something that's kind of close, then we can just hit E to extrude, S to scale down, and move these vertices to better match the nostril shape. And there we go. And once we have that, then we can extrude one more time. This time might be a little bit more difficult since it's kind of going up and in. So I'll select that edge loop, period on the number pad to zoom my view to it, and that way I can just use polypen and go straight up into the nose. Kind of gross, but I'll try not to think about it too much. Let's see, I'll just go to that ridge there. Now I might have to bring that down a little bit just so everything connects better. Maybe I'll put that edge right on that crease. I don't think it matters a whole lot, so let's just pick one. And I think we can cover too much, at least I certainly hope not. And if we need more detail, you know, we could add more loops right there if we really need to, but I don't think that's super necessary. Now let's go ahead and connect this with the cheek. So let's add a face there. That looks fine. But then we get this weird quad over here on the right, and I definitely don't like that. It's a triangle-shaped quad, and it's pretty close to a concave quad, and we definitely don't like those. So let's see what else we can do. We can try adding another edge loop, just like so, see if that helps us at all. And we can also add another edge loop up here, just kind of rearranging the details, so see if that gives us any nicer options. And overall, that's not a whole lot better. We've just kind of shifted where the triangle is. We could try also removing this edge loop and shifting where that edge loop is. We could add a new edge loop down here, but I also don't like the look of that. Another thing we could try is removing this edge loop and adding another one over there. Also don't like that. One thing that you can sometimes do with triangles is just move the edges closer together and merge them, but that's way too stretched. So we definitely need to add detail somewhere. And if we're going to have a junction, I don't really want it to be on this straight line of this cheek fold. So let's go ahead and just delete this face and see if we can come up with any better options. I don't mind this solution, but again, I don't like having this pole right on this straight crease. So I'm going to do something similar to that, but have a little protective loop that goes down and around. So I'm going to add an edge loop actually up towards the nose. That'll give us a little bit more detail up in the rounded part of the nose. That's certainly not a bad thing. Then I can continue this loop downwards and move the pole from the crease to more of a flat area. And then I'll just add another loop going towards the top of the lip, and that'll give us two quads there. And that definitely adds more detail than we probably need on the upper lip, but it gives us a nice quad solution, and at least it's contained, so the loop isn't messing with anything else around the face. So I don't think that's too bad. Which really helps us define the curvature a bit better, so I'm done. And improve the spacing up here on the nose. I think that looks a lot better. I think I could spend a bit more time tweaking this, but I'll leave this as is for now. And then let's go ahead and connect everything else. I'll bring down the loop from the nose all the way down to the chin. Then we can simply add 3 edge loops here and fill that up by tapping F with polypen, just like so, and then we can adjust the spacing later. Then let's continue these loops up and around. They're going to have to take a turn at some point because not all of these can, go up and towards the temple. Some of them are going to have to go straight through like so. So at some point we're going to have to make a turn in the topology. So let's go ahead and define where we want to do that. Let's say that this edge is the one that we want to go straight out, and everything else we want to turn upwards. So then we can insert an edge loop, Control R over here, and then let's take strokes, select all of the vertices on the bottom here, and then just connect that up. And we can do that one more time, like so, and then I'll use tweak to make some larger changes there. And I think now that I'm looking at it, that looks like it's a bit far, that's going to be a bit squished. So on second thought, let's undo that. Let's go ahead and delete those vertices. And then this loop here can be the first one to go outside towards the back of the jaw. So I'm going to make a more clear angle here with the topology, just to make it clear that these should connect, and then I can select those edges, connect this up, And now we have a loop that runs out towards the back of the jaw, and then the next one's going to run up towards the temple. So we've made a nice little junction there. And then we can continue this upwards, just like so. I have my strokes, T-strips set to follow, so I can just drag this straight up. That looks pretty good. We'll have to, adjust the count later once we figure out how we want to connect everything, but for now that looks pretty good. Then we can fill in this part of the cheek pretty easily just by selecting this edge loop and just bringing this up and over. And then let's go over to PolyPen now, since we're going to have to start working with some of the details here. And then we can use that cheekbone to split off in different directions. Maybe taking a turn and going down towards the jaw. We can give that a try. Just trying to make as many obvious connections as possible. And then if we need to add geometry, adding it to where we have flexibility. Make quads there. And actually I can probably just connect those vertices. That's close enough. And that looks, pretty messy at the moment, but I think once we smooth things out with relax, then that's gonna look okay. Though, if we start to go this direction, we're gonna get a six-sided pole, which I don't necessarily love. So I'll back up on that idea. You can see I'm just sort of problem solving in real time here. Every face is a little bit different and always has unique challenges. Let's try something a little more straightforward and just follow the anatomy around for now. And now this is definitely starting to get much too stretched, so we need to have some sort of pole here. So let's create a pole. Just a redirection of topology, so that can go in multiple directions. And then this is definitely starting to get kind of cramped here, but I'm not too worried because we have a lot of room to push this geometry down towards the bottom of the jaw. So once we relax things, I don't think it's going to be too cramped. And similarly, I think we can just connect all of these vertices. Actually, let me do that from selecting these bottom ones down here. Let's draw a line over there, and then control scroll upwards, connect up there. And now this looks just obviously way too stretched, but here's the thing, we can just take tweak here, and I'm going to take down the strength just to nudge things more subtly. And this is gonna look pretty gross for a second. It's not gonna look pretty at first. But once I have everything, roughly in place, maybe those vertices are a bit too close together, I can just take relax and really make this look a whole lot better. So it's more so about just getting everything into roughly the right position, and then trusting that relax can just smooth things out. And if we need to move this pole somewhere else to reduce the pinching around the jaw, then we can do that. Or move some of these vertices more this way just to give more room in that section. That is a little bit pinched still. So again, make big messy moves with tweak, hold down shift, and just relax that out. That looks a whole lot better. Okay, once we have that, then let's finish up around the brow. I'll do this with strokes. We can take this loop, control shift to select the shortest path. Just connect that up as a stroke. Looks like that missed, but I can just click and drag and hold that over. I'll try to simplify things just a little bit, just extruding it straight back. And then we definitely need at least some sort of change of direction up here, where we can go up towards the top of the head. Maybe we don't need 2 cuts quite yet, but we need some sort of change of direction there. And then let's switch over to polypen. Then we can continue the loop from the brow back towards the back of the head. And then once we have a decent loop that we can follow all the way around, let's go ahead and take the whole front section and let's go with strokes. And just complete that up. There we go. And then lastly, I'll take this whole loop and just make one big line all the way towards the front of the head. And that's gonna look pretty bad at first, but again, I can just smooth this out with relax. And it does a great job of fixing that. Down here where things are a little bit more delicate and I don't necessarily want to mess with the loops too much, I'll try not to use relax too directly because I have loops on, you know, really specific parts of the anatomy, and if I were to just kind of smooth that out, then that would mess with that. So I'll go back to tweak and just do a little bit of manual tweaking here. And maybe use relax just a little bit on the inside of the eyes here just to spread out the loops that are really close together. And once we have that, then we have a retopologized face. I might want to go through and, you know, relax some of these other areas as well. And if you wanted to continue onward, the next thing I would do is just finish up this jaw. Essentially just extrude this whole section backwards. But that's pretty easy with strokes. Just draw that out. Kind of define that corner. Draw that towards the front of the face. Just like so. And then we want to figure out how we want to attach the ear and all that, but I'll leave that for another time. Last thing, now that I'm looking at it, I might want to also tweak things just so that around the eye it's following the eyelid a little bit better, and we might need another loop in there to better define that. So maybe I'll go to tweak, use a really small brush, and define the bottom of that eyelid. Give a little more space here. Add another edge loop. And define that a bit better. And capture that curvature a little bit more. But I could go on and tweak spacing here for quite a long time, so I don't want to bore you with that, but you noticed I used strokes a lot. I used polypen a lot. I was not super picky about having messy topology because I knew that I could count on relax to just smooth it out when the time came. So it's more about what loops connect to what and making sure that the biggest, most important loops get defined first and then connecting everything else afterwards. I will use polystrips from time to time to just kind of extrude things out along obvious contours and make key important loops, but often I like using strokes for that as well. That's just kind of personal preference, but that's the cool thing about Retopoflow. The tools are flexible and you can use them however you'd like. And with that, we've covered everything that you need to know to get started with Retopoflow4. Thank you so much for watching and for supporting the tools. Our goal is to make Blender the #1 app for retopology, and with this version 4 series, we actually have a serious shot at doing that. We have a long to-do list on how to improve the tools, and I'm really excited to see where we can go from here. To subscribe for future updates, check out the Orange Turbine YouTube channel or follow us on social media. Again, thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and happy modeling.
All right, let's try this out. That is pretty awesome. Oh, yeah, that's pretty awesome. Okay. Okay. That's pretty awesome. And I just crashed it. Oh, I didn't. Oh, that's why. Okay, yeah, that'll work. This is a really cool tool. Really cool. Okay, so this should make retopology much easier. Unfortunately, I have run out of time for today. I have to meet up my brother for dinner, so I am going to call this the end of the stream today. I'm probably going to sneak in a stream or two during the week. before the weekend. I don't know. Maybe I'll keep the stream schedule a little more flexible. I don't know. Probably sneaking one in. Anyways, I'm going to call that a stream for today. It's a short one today. Just wanted to kind of familiarize myself with the retopology tool. And it looks like it works really well. So I'm going to go ahead and work on this off stream. And maybe what I'll do is I'll demo something next week. Okay. Anyways, guys, thanks for tuning in. Sorry I had to cut it a little bit short today. I got to meet up with my brother for dinner. But I will probably sneak in a stream during the week. So thanks for tuning in. I'll see y'all again soon. Have a great night. Cheers. Have a great night, Samantha. Hope you're having a blast playing Conan. Great game. Have a good night, guys. Cheers.